Section 1. The Man Who Knew Nothing and Everything. There is a moment, somewhere in the frozen silence of the far north, where a young man with dark, messy curls and a sword too heavy for his station looks out over an endless white horizon and realizes something awful. He realizes that the world does not care how hard you try. It does not reward sacrifice. It does not balance the scales for people who do the right thing. It simply moves on, brutal and indifferent, and leaves the honorable behind to bleed in the cold. That young man is Jon Snow. And if you have spent any real time with Game of Thrones, you already know that his story is not the triumphant arc of a hero finding his destiny and stepping into the throne room with banners flying and crowds cheering. It is something much more complicated and, in its own quiet, devastating way, much more beautiful than that. Jon Snow's story is the story of a man who was lied to from birth, died for his convictions, fell in love with the wrong person at the worst possible time, discovered a truth about himself that destroyed everything he had carefully built, and ended up walking alone into the frozen wilderness because there was simply nowhere left for him in the world that he had saved. If that sounds bleak, it is. But it is also the most honest and fully realized character arc in the entire series. Because Game of Thrones is, at its heart, a story about the cost of honor in a world that punishes it, and nobody pays that cost more completely, more consistently, or with less expectation of recompense than Jon Snow. So, tonight we are going to trace everything, not just the highlights or the famous moments. Everything. Every step of his journey from the moment a dying woman whispered a name in a tower in Dorne. Every wound he absorbed without complaint, every impossible choice he faced, every person he loved and lost and grieved and got up anyway, and every moment where the world took something precious from him and he chose, for reasons that say everything about who he was, to keep going. We are going to start at the very beginning. We are going to follow the shape of his tragedy from its root, and we are not going to stop until we reach that final haunting image of a man walking north into snow-dusted wilderness, a white direwolf at his side, new green shoots pushing up through the frost beneath his feet, and the whole frozen world opening up ahead of him like an answer to a question he had been asking his whole life. This is the complete story of Jon Snow. Get comfortable. We are going to take our time with it, because this story deserves nothing less. Let's set the scene properly. The world of Westeros is ancient in the way that places shaped by catastrophe tend to be ancient. Layers upon layers of history pressed into stone and tradition, and the stories families tell about themselves at night. In this world, bloodlines matter with a force that modern sensibility finds hard to fully register. Your name, the name you were born with, determines not just your social position, but your legal rights, your prospects for marriage and land and alliance, your entire relationship to the machinery of power that keeps the continent running, and the circumstances of your birth, whether your parents were formally wed, whether a lord claimed you publicly or left you nameless, can be the difference between a life of possibility and a life spent looking up at a ceiling that was placed above you before you could speak. Into this world, a child is born under circumstances so politically dangerous that simply existing puts him at risk. His mother is dying. His father, the man who actually raised him, is not his father at all. And the man who is his father has already been killed in a battle at a river crossing by the man who became king partly because of what people believed that father had done. The tragedy of Jon Snow begins before he even takes his first breath. His mother was Lyanna Stark. She was the youngest child of Rickard Stark, Lord of Winterfell, and by all accounts that survive her, she was extraordinary in the specific way of people who take up more space in a room than their physical size justifies. She was fierce, independent, a rider who was fast and fearless, possessed of the kind of presence that makes people remember her long after she has left the room. She was also, at the time of the events that led to her son's birth, deeply in love with a man who complicated everything in ways that would eventually cost thousands of people their lives. Rhaegar Targaryen was the crown prince of the Seven Kingdoms, heir to a dynasty that had held the realm together for 3 centuries through a mixture of genuine competence and the particular leverage that comes from owning the largest fire-breathing weapons in the known world. He was the eldest son of King Aerys II, a man who had begun his reign as a king of real promise and had descended, through whatever combination of paranoia and bad counsel, and the particular Targaryen inheritance toward instability, into something that history would remember as the Mad King. Rhaegar himself seemed to have escaped the worst of his father's tendencies. He was thoughtful, bookish, given to the harp and to long silences, a warrior who genuinely preferred scholarship, a man who felt the weight of prophecy and responsibility in ways that those around him sometimes found difficult to follow. He was also already married to Elia Martell of Dorne and had 2 children with her, Rhaenys and young Aegon. This fact will become important in ways that cost a great many people everything they had. The commonly accepted story, the story that justified a war and built a dynasty on its ashes, was that Rhaegar had taken Lyanna against her will, that he had seen her at the great tournament at Harrenhal, had ridden past his own wife to crown Lyanna Queen of Love and Beauty in a gesture so public and so charged with significance that everyone present understood it was not a chivalric compliment, but something much more personal, and that shortly afterward he had abducted her and taken her to a place in the Dornish mountains and done whatever men do when they take women by force and are insulated from consequence by their father's army. This was the story Robert Baratheon, Lyanna's betrothed, told himself and everyone else for the next 15 years. It was the story that gave his rebellion its moral weight, the story that turned his grief into righteous fury and his war into a crusade. Robert had loved Lyanna with the total consuming intensity of someone who has decided that a specific person is the answer to everything, and when that person was taken and then lost, the love curdled into something that sustained him, but also, slowly and then completely, destroyed him. The truth was different, in ways that rewrote the entire moral architecture of the beginning of the series. Rhaegar and Lyanna had loved each other. He had arranged the quiet annulment of his marriage to Elia Martell and married Lyanna in a secret ceremony, small and private, in Dorne. They had gone to the Tower of Joy together, and there Lyanna carried their child to term, and the delivery had gone terribly wrong, and she was dying, slowly and then very fast, when Ned Stark fought his way through the Kingsguard, who still stood outside the tower, and reached her at last. What happened in those final moments between Ned and Lyanna, in the room with the smell of blood and rose petals that would haunt his nightmares for the rest of his life, has the quality of something almost mythological. She pressed the infant into his arms, this boy with dark hair and a Stark look about him rather than the silver Targaryen coloring. She whispered the child's name, Aegon Targaryen, and she made Ned promise, with the last breath she had available to her, to keep the boy safe. Robert would kill him. Robert was hunting Targaryens. This child was the son of Rhaegar, whom Robert had already killed at the Trident, and Robert would not leave the work unfinished if he knew the child existed. Ned promised. He held his dying sister, and he promised, and then she was gone, and he was left standing in a tower with a living infant and a dead sister, and the full weight of a secret that would have to be carried alone for the rest of his life, or the boy would die. He named the child Jon, after Jon Arryn, his closest friend, the man who was like a second father to him. He carried the child home to Winterfell and told his wife Catelyn that this was his bastard son, born of an affair during the war, a woman named Willa he declined to discuss further. He buried the truth so deep inside himself that it never surfaced in any conversation, any letter, any moment of weakness through all the years that followed. That act of love and protection was also the founding act of Jon Snow's tragedy, because the lie that saved his life was also the lie that defined his life, shaping his sense of himself from the inside out in ways that could not be undone simply by learning the truth much later, when the truth's consequences had already been set in motion. If you are watching this right now, wherever you are in the world, drop it in the comments below, the time, the place, even just a quick hello. And while you are there, if you haven't subscribed yet, now is the moment. This is a long journey, and I want you along for all of it. Section 2. Ned's Greatest Lie. The Secret That Built a World. To understand Jon Snow fully, you first have to sit with what Ned Stark actually did when he walked out of the Tower of Joy, and what it cost him personally to do it. Eddard Stark was, in the world of Game of Thrones, something that world generally treated as either naive or dangerous. A genuinely honest man. Not merely someone with a reputation for honesty, the kind of honesty that is a strategic positioning, a way of building trust you can spend later. The kind of honesty that functions as a structural component of personality, the kind where dishonesty does not feel like an option, even when the honest path is clearly going to hurt you. He believed you told people the truth. He kept the promises he made. He behaved with the same integrity in private as in public, not because anyone was watching, but because the watching was irrelevant to the question of what the right behavior was. And then his dying sister asked him to lie for the rest of his life, and he said yes. The Tower of Joy stood in the Red Mountains of Dorne, which is about as far from Winterfell as you can get while remaining on the same continent. It was a tower that Rhaegar Targaryen had taken Lyanna Stark to, depending on whose account you trust, either because he abducted her, as Robert Baratheon and much of the world believed, or because they had chosen to disappear there together in the aftermath of their secret marriage, as the truth eventually revealed. Ned arrived too late to help his sister, and just in time to watch her die, but the fighting through the 3 Kingsguards stationed outside had already happened, and 3 men who had never in their lives abandoned a post were dead in the dirt outside a tower that was supposed to hold something worth protecting. What he found inside was Lyanna, alive for a few more hours, in a room of blue winter roses and blood, and a newborn child who was entirely unaware of the magnitude of what he had just been born into. Ned held his sister's hand while she told him the truth about what had happened, the marriage and the child, and Rhaegar, and she made him promise, and he made the promise, and then she died with her blood on the stones of a tower in the south, while the war she had inadvertently started was just finishing destroying the dynasty her son had been born into. The ride home from Dorne must have been one of the longest journeys of Ned Stark's life. He was carrying a secret that changed the shape of the world he was returning to. Robert Baratheon, his closest friend, his brother-in-arms, the man who had just won a war largely to avenge what he believed was Lyanna's abduction, that man now sat on the Iron Throne. And if he knew that the child in Ned's arms was the true-born son of the man he had killed and the woman he claimed to love, there was not a version of events in which the child survived the revelation. Robert's hatred of Targaryens was personal and consuming. He had the Targaryen children killed, Rhaegar's children with Elia Martell, 2 small children, killed on his orders in the sack of King's Landing. He claimed it was war. He moved on. But the willingness to permit, even retrospectively endorse, the killing of infants in order to prevent a future claim on the throne was a clear statement of the kind of threat the bloodline represented in Robert's mind, and Ned walked home with that knowledge and a baby who embodied exactly that threat. He gave Jon the Snow name. He brought him to Catelyn and said the child was his and refused to say anything more. He absorbed Catelyn's pain at this, the quiet ongoing wound of an unexplained bastard child in her home, because absorbing that pain was what the promise required, and Ned Stark kept his promises. What did this cost him? More than people usually give him credit for. It cost him the ability to be fully known by anyone. There is a specific loneliness in carrying a secret so central that you cannot, in any conversation with anyone, refer to it or be fully honest about the thing it touches, which is to say, almost everything. The story Catelyn believed about him, that he had been briefly unfaithful during the war, was a story that damaged their relationship in ways that Ned could feel and could not correct without unraveling everything. The story the court believed, that Ned Stark, the most honorable man in Westeros, had fathered a bastard, was a story that sat against everything he was and that he could not dispute. He paid for it in a particular way when King Robert came to Winterfell with his offer to make Ned his Hand of the King. Ned's instinct was to refuse. He wanted to stay in Winterfell, to be home, to raise his family in the cold north, away from the politics that had already claimed so much. Catelyn argued for accepting, for reasons of political necessity. And Ned, who had spent 17 years keeping the most important secret in the known world, went south into the Viper's Nest of King's Landing and began asking honest questions in a place where honest questions were the most dangerous weapon available, and paid for his honesty with his life. His honesty, which he had maintained in everything except the one enormous exception of Jon's origin, was what killed him. He told Cersei what he had discovered about Joffrey's parentage before he acted on it, because warning an opponent before you move against them is what a man of honor does, and Cersei used the warning to act first. His refusal to play the game the way the game was played, his insistence on treating honor as a practical strategy rather than a luxury for people who could afford it, his absolute inability to be the thing the situation required him to be, dishonest, maneuvering, politically flexible, All of this converged on the steps of the Sept of Baelor on a hot day in King's Landing, with his daughters watching, and ended his life. The lie he told for Jon's sake cost him everything, and Jon never knew. Not until it was far too late. Not until Ned was long dead, and the secret had survived him only because Bran could see through time, and Sam could read old annulment papers, and the two of them could put it together. Jon found out in a crypt in Winterfell, surrounded by stone Starks, holding this information that changed everything and changed nothing, because the man who had given up his reputation and eventually his life to protect Jon from it was already gone. The weight of what Ned Stark did is not just that it was an act of love, though it was. It is that it was an act of love sustained over decades at enormous personal cost, made by a man for whom sustaining a lie was genuinely one of the hardest things the world could have asked of him. And he did it anyway because his sister asked, and because a child's life depended on it, and because some promises are bigger than the difficulty of keeping them. It was the most honest act of his life, in the sense that it expressed, with perfect clarity, what he genuinely valued above everything else: the protection of someone who couldn't protect themselves. Jon Snow spent his life in the shadow of a dead man's love. He just didn't know it. This code was not well suited to the political culture of Westeros, which operated on deception as standard practice and treated pure honesty as a kind of weaponizable naivety. It eventually killed him, publicly and in front of his daughters, on the steps of the Great Sept of Baelor. But before it killed him, it produced, in the specific context of the lie he told about Jon, something that was paradoxically both the most dishonest thing he ever did and the most loving. He went home to Catelyn with an infant he claimed was his bastard son. Catelyn Tully was not a woman given to scenes or prolonged emotional displays. She was the daughter of a powerful Riverlands lord, raised to understand the political realities of her world with clear-eyed pragmatism, married to a man she had not chosen but had come to genuinely love, responsible for a household of considerable scale and complexity. She absorbed this information because she had no other available response that was consistent with the dignity of her position, and she managed the situation with the grace that the culture expected of her. But she could not look at Jon without feeling it. The wound was not precise anger at the child, because the child had done nothing. It was the kind of wound that sits underneath anger, the wound of believing yourself not quite enough, not quite what the person you love needed when the moment came. She had given Ned everything she had to give. She had married him when he was not the son she had been intended for, had come to love him genuinely rather than by obligation, had borne his children and managed his household and been faithful in every possible direction. And he had, she believed, gone away to war and found someone else for a season and come home with the evidence in his arms. She never warmed to the boy. And children notice these things with a precision that is sometimes terrifying, cataloging every glance, every silence, every small exclusion, assembling the evidence into a conclusion about their place in the world that they then have to decide whether to fight against or accept. Jon noticed early, and he spent his childhood navigating around Catelyn's particular variety of cold with a quiet care that never quite became resentment. He understood, even without the words for it, that what he was dealing with was her response to a situation she had not chosen rather than a judgment of his personal worth. He was perceptive in the way that outsiders often are, forced by circumstances into the habit of reading emotional atmospheres that those who belong fully to a space never have to read. What saved him was Ned himself, and the particular quality of relationships he built with his siblings. Ned gave him everything a father could give in terms of values and formation and genuine personal regard. He taught Jon swords and honor and the particular northern philosophy of straightforward dealing, the conviction that a man's word was his most important possession, and that leadership meant accepting hard consequences rather than avoiding them. He was demonstrably Jon's father in every way that actually shapes a person, and the bond between them was real and fierce, even if it had a secret lodged in its foundation that neither of them could acknowledge. The question Jon kept bringing back to Ned was the one question Ned could not answer. Who was his mother? He watched Ned navigate away from direct answers, watched him find the angles and the evasions, and filed away the specific texture of this avoidance, which was different from ordinary privacy. It had the texture of protection rather than secrecy. Jon understood, somewhere below the level of articulation, that his father was keeping something from him for reasons, not from indifference. This understanding did not make the not knowing easier to bear, but it gave it a frame that kept it from becoming corrosive. The last time they spoke, before Ned rode south with Robert Baratheon and the household mobilized for King's Landing, Ned made a promise. "The next time we meet," he told Jon, "I will tell you about your mother." He meant it. The promise was genuine, and it was something Ned had clearly decided, alone with himself in the way that private decisions get made, was something he could finally give his nephew when Jon was old enough to handle it. Jon held on to those words with both hands. They never met again. Ned died on the steps of the Great Sept, betrayed by Joffrey's vanity and his own inflexibility in the face of a political crisis he could have survived by being less honest. He died with the secret still inside him, and the promise died with him, and Jon was left with a question that now had no living person who could answer it. This is the wound at the center of Jon Snow's character, the one that everything else orbits. Not just the not knowing, though the not knowing was real and lasting. The closing of the door, the permanent impossibility of the answer now. There are losses that you grieve and then move through, and there are losses that simply become part of the structure of your life, changing the shape of every room you move through without ever being fully resolved. For Jon, the question of his mother was always the second kind. What it produced in him, this particular variety of loss and the life it was embedded in, was a person with a very specific and very powerful set of qualities. He was drawn to people who didn't fit, who were defined by what they lacked rather than what they had. He extended to the free folk a kind of basic human regard that his brothers in the Night's Watch could not manage because they had spent too long treating the wildlings as the enemy to remember that the enemy was also people. He was skeptical of rank and title as measures of a person's worth because rank and title had been used against him his entire childhood in ways he had never fully consented to. These were not coincidences. They were expressions of what the lie had made him, in the deepest and most functional part of his character. Someone who understood without being told that the categories the world uses to sort people are not the same as the truth about those people. There is also this quality that Ned's secret produced in him, more subtle and more important than the others, a facility with the question of identity itself, a lived understanding that the self you present to the world is not always the same as the self that exists underneath it, and that the gap between those two things is not necessarily dishonesty, but sometimes protection. Jon had spent his life performing the role of bastard son with a kind of dignity that refused to let the performance become the full truth. He was always more than what the label said he was. He had always known this, even without the specific knowledge that the label was technically wrong. When the truth finally arrived, it did not give him a new self. It simply confirmed what he had always, somewhere below articulation, already been. Section 3. A Bastard's Childhood. Growing up wrong in Winterfell. Winterfell in winter is a castle that knows exactly how to keep the cold out. Thick stone walls that have been standing since before anyone currently alive was born. Central hearths that burn through the long, dark months, with the steady reliability of institutions that have learned the specific lessons of centuries. Great halls where meals are taken collectively, and the warmth of shared fires and shared food does what walls alone cannot. The warmth of people in the same space choosing to be, for a few hours at least, a single thing rather than separate ones. For Jon Snow, growing up at the center of all this activity, it was home in all the ways that matter, and simultaneously not quite home in a way that never entirely disappeared. He belonged there in the sense that he had always been there, that it was the only world he knew, that the people in it were the only family he had. He did not belong there in the sense that there were rooms he was not supposed to enter during certain occasions, that there was a name he was not supposed to carry, that there was a table he was not supposed to sit at when guests of sufficient rank were present, and the distinction between the lord's legitimate children and his bastard had to be made visible. These were not Jon's rules. They had been in place long before he arrived, and would be in place long after he left. The specific institutional architecture of a feudal society that runs on bloodline legitimacy and needs every interaction to reinforce the hierarchy. Jon navigated them with a quiet and genuine grace that never quite became acceptance. The grace of someone who has decided not to let his circumstances become his identity, even while acknowledging that his circumstances are real. Robb Stark was the closest thing to a perfect older brother that the specific emotional needs of Jon's childhood required. Not because Robb was perfect, he was not. He was competitive and proud, and occasionally too certain about things he should have been less certain about, which is maybe the most consistently stark quality across the entire family. But he was absolutely uninterested in the bastard question as a factor in how he treated Jon, and that unconcern was the most valuable thing he could have offered. They trained together every day, these two boys who would become different kinds of extraordinary, pushing each other in the way that genuine competition demands, each one making the other better at the specific things that their world required. Arya was the sibling who held the most of Jon's heart, and the reason was a recognition that ran in both directions. They were the two Stark children who had inherited Ned's dark coloring rather than Catelyn's auburn and blue, and this surface similarity pointed at something deeper. Arya was a girl who wanted to fight and ride and be in the middle of things, and the world told her daily in 100 different ways that this was not who she was supposed to be. Jon was a lord's son in every functional sense except the legal one that determined everything, and the world told him daily with the same patient persistence that the exception was the only part that mattered. They had found in each other a kind of mirror, not of their specific situations, which were different enough in their details, but of the feeling of those situations, the specific combination of loving the world you were in and being refused full membership in it, the daily choice between resentment and something larger than resentment. The gift he gave Arya before leaving for the Wall was one of the most quietly significant acts in the first season. He had a sword commissioned for her, slender and needle-thin, designed for a girl of her size and temperament, rather than for the girl she was supposed to be. He presented it to her with the kind of casual tenderness that is only possible between people who genuinely see each other, and she named it Needle because needlework was what Sansa told her a highborn girl should be learning, and she had decided that her needle was going to be a different kind entirely. The sword was not a practical joke or a subversive gesture. It was Jon saying, "I see who you actually are, and I think you are exactly right to be that person." Bran and Rickon existed in Jon's relationship landscape as beloved younger brothers who were still becoming whoever they were going to be. He was patient with them in the way of people who genuinely like children rather than merely tolerating them, who find the endless specific energy of small boys more interesting than exhausting. He taught Bran archery in the training yard with a patience that the activity did not necessarily reward, since Bran was more interested in climbing than shooting, but Jon understood that the teaching was about more than the skill being transmitted. The direwolf came into his life at a moment that felt entirely random, and has never felt entirely random in retrospect. The discovery of the direwolf pups was not supposed to include Jon. He was not supposed to be there in the same way that his siblings were, because the find was of a female direwolf killed by an antler through the throat, and her litter of 5 pups, one for each Stark child, and the whole thing had the quality of an omen in a world where omens are sometimes real. Jon was the one who pointed out the symmetry, 5 pups and 5 Stark children, and then went looking for the 6th, the one he could sense at the edge of the group, rather than seeing it first. The pup was white as snow, smaller than the others, with pale red eyes that tracked everything in the pale, silent way of something that is always watching. An albino, separated from his siblings by the particular variety of difference that makes things separate even within the same litter. Jon called him Ghost because he was so quiet, because he moved without sound through the cold air, because there was something about him that was present without being fully of the world in the ordinary way. Their bond was immediate and went beyond what the word companion covers. The ward connection between Jon and Ghost was handled more subtly in the show than in the books, which gave it a more explicit mystical dimension, but it was always there in the texture of their interactions, the specific quality of attention they paid to each other, the way Ghost always seemed to be oriented toward Jon regardless of what else was happening, the way Jon's moods seemed to be registered by the wolf before Jon had fully processed them himself. For a boy whose entire life was defined by conditional belonging, the unconditional quality of Ghost's attachment was not trivial. It was not about rank or legitimacy or whether his parents had been formally married. It was not about what name he carried or what table he was allowed to sit at. It was simply, you and I recognize you, and wherever you go, I will be there. The decision to join the Night's Watch built slowly and then arrived all at once, the way decisions do when they have been building long enough that the arrival feels inevitable rather than chosen. There was no future at Winterfell for Jon that was not defined by his bastard status in ways that made everything slightly smaller than it should have been. He could have become a member of some lord's household, respected for his skills but always carrying the asterisk. He could have stayed at Winterfell itself, Robb's trusted companion and castellan, but in a role that would always have had the quality of generosity rather than right. The Night's Watch offered something different. The vow you took when you joined explicitly stripped away all prior identity, all prior rank and name and distinction. Brothers of the Watch were brothers equally, at least in theory, and Jon had the idealism of someone who had not yet learned the full distance between the theory of an institution and the reality of one. Benjen Stark was already there, and this made the Watch feel familiar and possible in a way it might not otherwise have. And Ned, who worried privately about the choice but understood it, gave Jon his blessing with words that contained more truth than either of them recognized at the time. You might not have my name, but you have my blood. You are a Stark. He was also, though Ned could not say so, Aegon Targaryen. He was both of these things simultaneously, and the combination would eventually change everything. Section 4. The Wall. Finding a brotherhood in the cold. The Wall is, first of all, impossible. It stands 700 feet at its greatest height, 300 miles from sea to sea, built out of ice that does not melt in summer, infused according to the oldest records with magic worked by people who are mostly gone now, and by a pact whose terms have been disputed and reinterpreted and essentially forgotten. It should not exist. It does. This is the Wall's most important characteristic. It is impossible, and it is there anyway, which is a useful thing for a defensive structure to be. Castle Black sits at its base and is not impressive in the way that Winterfell is impressive. It is large in the way of things that were once larger and have been whittled down by time and neglect and the gradual reduction of the purpose they were built to serve. The Night's Watch had numbered 50,000 sworn brothers at its founding, or so the histories said, and what Jon arrived to find was a few hundred men, most of them there because some authority somewhere had decided that exile to a freezing rock was preferable to execution, and who therefore had the particular quality of people who have already lost most of what they had and are getting by on whatever remains. Jon arrived expecting something it wasn't. The idealism of youth is not the same as stupidity. It is the condition of someone who has not yet had enough evidence to calibrate their hopes against reality. And Jon's hope was genuine and informed by real knowledge. He had grown up hearing stories of the Watch as a great and noble institution. He arrived to find men who were, many of them, doing their best in difficult circumstances with limited resources, and also some men who were simply not particularly good people, making the minimum required effort to not be sent somewhere worse. The hazing that began almost immediately on his arrival was the first adjustment. He was better with a sword than any other recruit. He carried himself with the unconscious confidence of someone who had grown up in a castle with the best available instructors, and this confidence read, to men who had not had any of those advantages, as arrogance. They resented him for being better at the thing they were all supposed to be there to learn, which is an entirely human response, even if it is not a particularly admirable one. Then Samwell Tarly arrived and changed the dynamic. Sam was not equipped for the Night's Watch in any obvious way. He was soft, frightened, breathlessly unfit, at beasties to shoot, and the product of a father's contempt so comprehensive and so sustained that it had become structural rather than occasional, the kind of contempt that builds itself into the way a person moves through a room. Randall Tarly of Horn Hill had decided that his bookish, gentle eldest son was an embarrassment to a Marshall family's reputation, and had given Sam a simple choice: take the black voluntarily or be killed in a hunting accident that would be made to look convincing. Sam had taken the black, arrived at Castle Black, and immediately became the object of precisely the kind of sustained mockery that people whose self-esteem is entirely constructed from looking down on someone else tend to direct at the most available target. Jon stepped in, not with a speech or a confrontation, though the words were direct when they came. He used the social capital he had already built, the informal authority of someone who carries himself well and is obviously capable, and told the other recruits that this was done. Sam was their brother now. The Watch was nothing if they were not loyal to each other. He waited for the pushback, and it didn't come, because there was something about the way Jon said things that made the disagreeing feel more costly than the agreeing. What happened next was one of those small moments that the show handled with the care they deserve. Sam and Jon became genuinely close. in the way that people become close when they recognize in each other a fundamental honesty that is rarer than it should be. Sam was brilliant in precisely the ways Jon was not, possessed of a scholar's memory and a reader's instinct for patterns and connections, and he saw Jon clearly in a way that most people took much longer to manage, as someone who was not just a good fighter, but a natural leader, the kind of person who made the people around him better without appearing to try. Sam also, in this context, provided Jon something that his background had never fully given him, someone who knew about books. The knowledge that would eventually save the world was in old books that nobody was reading, and Sam was the only person in the Night's Watch who was reading them. When the time came for the information about dragonglass and Valyrian steel to matter, it was Sam who had it, and it was Jon who understood immediately what to do with it. And the combination of these two very different kinds of intelligence was not accidental, but the product of a friendship that had been built carefully over years. Jeor Mormont, the Lord Commander, recognized Jon's potential with the particular eye of someone who has spent enough years evaluating people to tell real quality from surface performance. His decision to make Jon his personal steward frustrated Jon in the specific way of people who want to be active and useful and have been assigned to administrative work, which felt like a step backward from the ranger position he had imagined for himself. Mormont understood something Jon couldn't see from inside his own frustration. He wasn't training Jon to swing a sword. He was training Jon to lead, which required understanding the full machinery of what they were doing, not just the front line part. The relationship between Mormont and Jon had the quality of an understated mentorship, never quite speaking aloud what it was. The older man passing along understanding through assignment and expectation rather than explicit teaching. When the White attacked Mormont in the night, risen from the dead in Castle Black itself, and Jon saved his life by burning it with a lamp at the cost of significant burns to his own hands, Mormont gave him Longclaw afterward. The Valyrian steel bastard sword with the pommel carved in the shape of a direwolf. He gave it without ceremony or extended speech, because Mormont was not a man for extended speeches, and what the gesture meant was understood without being stated. Jon took the Night's Watch vows with complete seriousness, in a forest beyond the wall, in front of a weirwood tree, Ghost at his side, the words landing in him with all the weight of a commitment he meant to keep for the rest of his life. Night gathers, and now my watch begins. It shall not end until my death. The vows were enormous, and he was young, and he meant them entirely, and the world was going to spend the next several years testing exactly how much he meant them. The answer was more than anyone expected, including Jon himself. Section 5. Beyond the Wall. Love, Wildlings, and the White Walkers. The Great Ranging was Mormont's most ambitious response to the accumulating evidence that the North was not behaving the way the North was supposed to behave. 2 Rangers, dead and risen, and sent back to Castle Black to attack the Lord Commander in his own rooms. His first Ranger missing without trace. Reports from Wildling sources, such as they were, of something moving in the far north that moved wrong, that moved like death walking. The Watch mobilized what it could mobilize, more than 200 men, and marched north through the wall. Jon went as Mormont's steward and shadow, Ghost silent at his side, and the experience of moving through that landscape changed something fundamental in the way he understood the world. Beyond the wall was not the South. It was not subject to the frameworks that organized life south of it, the hierarchies of name and blood, the systems of property and title, the institutional arrangements that determined who mattered and how much. Out here, you survived or you didn't, and the determining factors were skill and luck and the quality of the people standing next to you, and nothing else was in the calculation. There was also this. The free folk who lived out here were people, not the savages of Night's Watch tradition and Southern contempt, people with their own politics and their own culture and their own fierce specific pride. A people who had chosen difficulty over submission for so many generations that the choosing had become their identity. They called themselves the Free Folk for a reason, and they meant it down to the bone. Jon met Ygritte in the Frostfang Mountains, at the edge of an ambush on a small party of wildling scouts. She was taken captive in the engagement that followed. The others were killed. Corran Halfhand, the legendary ranger leading this scouting expedition, made the assessment that prisoners beyond the wall were a liability no party could afford. He gave Jon the order to kill her. Jon stood with Longclaw drawn and Ygritte kneeling before him, looking up at him without a single trace of fear in her expression, and put his sword away. She was not what he had expected. She was fiercely intelligent and immediately, comprehensively unimpressed by him. Her hair was the brilliant red that wildling tradition called kissed by fire, a marker of luck and vitality that she wore without any apparent self-consciousness. And she had an archer's assessment of everything she looked at, including Jon, which she found wanting in several interesting ways. She thought he was a crow, which was wildling slang for Night's Watch, with all the connotations of carrion-picking institutional cowardice that term was meant to carry. She thought he was a kneeler, which was how the free folk described everyone south of the Wall who bent their knees to kings, and in her vocabulary, this was not a neutral description. She also thought he was interesting. She would not have admitted this if asked, but it was there in the quality of her attention to him, the specific way she argued with him, as opposed to dismissing him, the care she took in trying to explain the world, as she understood it to someone who had clearly been given a profoundly incomplete picture. The complicated series of events that followed involved Jon killing Qhorin Halfhand on the Ranger's own explicit orders, a command delivered in the specific shorthand of two people who understood each other well enough not to need full sentences, as a way of proving to the wildlings that Jon had genuinely turned his cloak. He was then taken before Mance Rayder, the king beyond the wall, former Night's Watch Ranger turned wildling leader, who assessed Jon with the unhurried intelligence of someone who had been played many games in many different rooms and knew most of the moves. Mance accepted him, conditionally, and Jon began the spy's life, the long exercise in sustained deception that requires not only maintaining a false story, but maintaining it while genuine feelings are forming that make the story increasingly false from the inside. The months he spent with the wildling host were months in which his understanding of the world was fundamentally revised. He learned the free folk the way you learn something when you have no choice but to be present with it, completely and with all your senses engaged. He learned their oral histories and their customs and their relationships to the land, learned the specific kind of freedom they carried that was inseparable from the hardship that made it possible, learned that the things the Night's Watch called savagery were often the adaptations of people who had survived without institutional support for generations. And he fell in love with Ygritte. Not as a decision, but as a discovery, the way you discover that you have already been in love for some time and are only now catching up to the fact. The cave in the Frostfangs, with the hot spring and the warm dark and the sound of water moving through stone, was where the pretense became impossible to maintain even privately. He broke his vows in that cave. He knew exactly what he was doing. He had no excuse available and did not look for one. He made a choice with open eyes and felt the weight of it clearly, and made it anyway, because some things matter more than the forms you have committed yourself to. And what was happening between him and Ygritte was one of those things. What they had afterward was the kind of connection that is only possible between two people who have stripped away the performances they usually move through the world wearing. She did not have any expectation of who he should be. He was not performing anything for her. They argued constantly and brilliantly, fought about everything that mattered to them, and found the arguments themselves a form of intimacy that no amount of agreement could have produced. She taught him what she knew. He listened with an openness that his pride sometimes struggled with, and his genuine curiosity always overcame. "You know nothing, Jon Snow." She told him this in every key and every tone, and the truth it contained was layered and consistent. He was operating from incomplete information about the world and about himself, and she was offering to help correct this, and he was often too stubborn to take what she was offering. He left when he had to leave. The wildling host was moving toward the wall, and the Night's Watch was unprepared, and his brothers were going to die, and Jon Snow could not watch that happen when he could prevent it. This was simply true of him. He was not wired for the alternative. He kissed her goodbye in the way of someone who knows it is goodbye and cannot say so directly, and then he rode away, and her arrows followed him. 3 arrows, in the shoulder, the arm, the leg, not in the throat, not in the chest, not in any of the places that end things. She could have killed him with any of those shots. She was an extraordinary archer, and he was an excellent target, and she had 3 clear opportunities. She did not take any of them in the lethal sense. She shot him the way you hurt someone you love, when you are too angry to speak, and too in love to do the worst thing that would actually end it. They met again during the assault on Castle Black, in the chaos and noise and heat of a battle that was both enormous and, for the two of them, intensely personal. She was fighting with complete commitment by then, the wounded anger of a woman who had been lied to and knows it, and is determined not to let the knowing make her weak. She moved through the battle with the efficiency of someone who has been doing this all her life, until she saw Jon across the fire and the screaming, and her hand paused on her bow. Ollie was a boy who had come to the Night's Watch carrying a grief too large for his body, both parents killed in a wildling raid, and he had found in the Night's Watch a purpose that was also a permission to hate in organized ways. He put an arrow through Ygritte before she could resolve the pause in her hand. She fell toward Jon rather than away from him, which is the most unbearably appropriate thing, and he caught her, and she died in his ard in the middle of a battle that did not stop happening around them, because battles do not accommodate grief. She said it once more, very quietly, with the last of what she had. "You know nothing, Jon Snow," and then she was gone. The grief Jon carried from that moment forward had a specific and productive quality. He had been wrong about things, and she had known it before he did, and she had tried to correct him, and he had not fully listened, and she had been right, and she was dead, and those facts were going to have to live inside him for the rest of his life, as motivation rather than weight. He took her north of the Wall, into the lands she had lived in, and he gave her fire in the wildling way, and he stood in the cold watching the smoke rise, and he understood with absolute clarity that the free folk were not the enemy. They had never been the enemy. The only enemy was the thing he had seen at Hardhome. Hardhome was where the theoretical became concrete and the scale became visible. Jon had gone north with a small force to evacuate the free folk settlement on the coast before the dead arrived. The dead arrived while they were still working. The Night King's army crashed over the walls in numbers that made planning irrelevant. Jon discovered that Valyrian steel worked on White Walkers in a way that almost nothing else did, and he used this discovery with the concentrated efficiency of a man who understands he has approximately 30 seconds to use it before the window closes. He survived. Many did not. And then the Night King stood on the cliffs above the water and raised his hands, and everything that had just died on the shore stood up and joined his army. Jon Snow looked at that moment and knew what needed to happen. Not specifically, not in detail, but in principle. The living could not keep giving free soldiers to the dead, and every human death in any conflict that was not the war against the Night King was exactly that. He went back to Castle Black with this knowledge, and the intention to act on it, and the acting on it was going to get him killed. Section 6, Lord Commander, the weight of true leadership. Elections in the Night's Watch were ancient in their form and frequently chaotic in their execution, and the election that made Jon Snow Lord Commander followed the pattern. Several rounds of voting, no clear winner. Sam Tarly making a speech that was more honest than polished and more effective than anyone expected, including Sam himself. Maester Aemon casting the deciding vote with the serenity of someone who had been watching history long enough to recognize it when it was standing in front of him. Jon had not campaigned for the position. He was not at all certain he wanted it. He had imagined a ranger's life, out in the cold doing the direct work of defending the border, not the administrative and diplomatic work of running the institution that did the defending. This was not his first or last miscalculation about what he actually wanted versus what was actually necessary. There is a specific kind of person who leads well precisely because they did not come to leadership hungry for it. The hunger for power tends to corrupt the exercise of it because every decision gets filtered through the question of whether it serves the holding of the position rather than the purpose the position exists to serve. Jon had no hunger for the Lord Commander's seat. He had a strong sense of what needed to be done and a deepening understanding that nobody else in the Watch was going to do it. And so he took the responsibility with the same attitude he had taken every responsibility in his life, as a thing that had arrived and that he was now obligated to carry as well as he could. The execution of Jon Slynt was the new Lord Commander's first and clarifying act. Slynt had been sent to the Wall by Tyrion Lannister as a politically convenient exile after his role in the betrayal of Eddard Stark, and he had arrived with the specific arrogance of a man who believes his connections protect him from ordinary accountability. Jon gave him a direct order. Slynt refused, publicly, in front of the assembled Watch, with the contempt of someone who is certain the refusal will cost him nothing. Jon gave him the order again, formally, Slynt refused again. Jon gave him one more opportunity. Slynt, apparently under the impression that his prior life in King's Landing political circles still had currency in this particular context, refused a third time. Jon took him outside, stood over him with Longclaw, thought about his father, and took the swing. Stannis Baratheon, present with his army, gave a single nod. It was the nod of a man who had spent his life watching other men fail to make hard decisions and had developed a specific and visible respect for the people who did make them. The message was received, not warmly and not by everyone, but received. A Lord Commander who would execute a defiant officer in front of the assembled watch was a Lord Commander who meant what he said, and meaning what you say at Castle Black in this particular era was a quality that existed in short enough supply to be notable. What followed was the defining project of Jon's command, opening the wall to the free folk. He had seen Hardhome. He had watched the Night King's army grow by the thousands in a single night from the casualties of the battle, and he understood in the specific way of someone who has seen a thing rather than heard about it, that every human being who died north of the wall was a soldier handed to the enemy for free. The free folk were not the enemy. They were a population sitting between the living and the dead, and every one of them who died before the dead arrived would be raised and turned against the living. The mathematics were simple, and the political implications of acting on them were enormous. He made the argument as directly as he was capable of making it. He told his brothers what he had seen. He described the Night King's power without embellishment, because the unembellished version was sufficiently terrifying. He acknowledged that bringing the free folk south of the wall meant asking the Watch to do something it had never done, and had defined itself against doing for its entire institutional history. He made the argument and waited for acceptance, and found, in most of the Watch, something that acceptance was not. They heard him. Many of them believed him. They could not make themselves do what he was asking, because the hatred of the wildlings had been part of what they were since before they could remember. And that kind of deep cultural conditioning does not yield to argument even when the argument is right. The resentment built across months, fed by every ship of wildlings that came through the gate, every face that was the wrong face, every reminder that their Lord Commander was asking them to accept as neighbors the people they had been trained to see as existential threats. There was a negotiation with the Then warrior Sigorn that had to be conducted with the diplomacy of someone juggling competing truths simultaneously. The free folk did not trust crows and had generations of excellent reasons not to. The crows did not trust wildlings and had generations of excellent reasons not to. Jon was asking both groups to act against their instincts and their histories in service of a shared survival that neither group could fully bring themselves to feel at the level of immediate experience. He was asking them to trust an abstraction, the future, the threat, the thing coming, over the very concrete and specific grievances sitting right there in front of them in the form of each other's faces. That he succeeded at all, that any free folk came south, is a testament to something about Jon that is easy to miss because it is so quiet. He was genuinely convincing, not through rhetoric or manipulation, but through consistency. He did what he said he would do. He kept the agreements he made. He did not ask the free folk for anything he had not also asked of himself. People who are accustomed to being lied to by people in authority are exquisitely sensitive instruments for detecting sincerity, and what they detected in Jon Snow was a man who was telling the truth, as he understood it, and who had staked his position, his safety, and ultimately his life on it. They came south, thousands of them, through the gate at Castle Black, moving into a land that had been at war with them within living memory. It was an extraordinary sight and an uncomfortable one, and it produced in the men of the Watch exactly the anger and resentment that Jon had anticipated. He absorbed the anger. He managed the resentment as best he could. He kept the arrangement functioning through sheer force of personal authority and the specific credibility of someone who has made unpopular decisions that turned out to be right before. The trap when it came was elegant and terrible in its simplicity. Ollie came with word that someone had information about Benjen Stark, Jon's missing uncle, the one person Jon had never stopped wondering about, the unresolved question that sat alongside the unresolved question of his mother in the collection of things he had never been given answers to. Of course he followed. He had always been susceptible to the things he had been denied, and the people who planned this knew that. The courtyard. The sign. Traitor. One by one the knives came in, and each man said for the watch as he put steel into Jon's body. And the words were terrible not because they were insincere, but because they were sincere. Because these men genuinely believed they were doing the necessary thing. Because the gap between their belief and the truth of what they were preventing was exactly as wide as the gap between what the Night's Watch thought it was protecting and what was actually threatening the world. They were wrong in the worst way, certain and well-intentioned and catastrophically, world-shakingly wrong. Ollie was last. He came forward with tears running down his face. This boy Jon had looked after and felt genuine personal responsibility for. This child whose grief had been real and whose reasoning from that grief had led him to a place that grief leads people when there is nobody to redirect it towards something other than hate. For the watch, Ollie said, and put the last knife in. Jon fell in the snow of the courtyard and looked up at the dark sky and heard ghosts howling somewhere in the castle, and then there was nothing. The nothing that Beric Dondarrion would later describe as having visited 6 times and found no easier any of those times. The nothing that was all there was. Section 7. Death and Resurrection. What came back from the dark? The thing about Beric Dondarrion was that he remembered each of his deaths and came back from them progressively diminished, as if the soul was a candle and each resurrection burned it a little lower. He was honest about this in the way of someone who has accepted a truth too strange to bother dressing up. By the time Jon met him beyond the wall, Beric had been resurrected 6 times by the power working through Thoros of Myre, and he had the quality of a man who is ghost enough already to find the company of ghosts natural. Jon remembered nothing, not a corridor, not a light, not a presence or an absence, not warmth or cold or the sensation of being without sensation. He died, and he was dead, and then he woke, and the gap between those two things contained absolutely nothing that his memory could retrieve. This is significant in a way the show does not fully articulate, but leaves visible if you watch carefully. Jon came back from death without the particular weight of having experienced something on the other side that he had to integrate. He came back clean, in that specific sense. He had lost the specific version of fear that is rooted in not knowing what death contains, because now he knew. Nothing, and nothing, he found, was acceptable. Death was not a door to somewhere else. It was just the end of one thing, the end of obligation, the completion of a contract. Melisandre performed the ritual from a place of desperate and shattered faith. Her confidence in the Lord of Light had been broken by the failure of her prophecy about Stannis, by the burning of Shireen that she had sanctioned, and that had produced not victory, but catastrophe, and she had arrived at Castle Black in the private ruins of her certainty, going through the motions of priesthood without quite believing in what the motions were supposed to accomplish. When Davos asked her to try, she had almost nothing to offer except the willingness to try, which turned out to be enough. She prepared the body, said the words, waited. Nothing happened. The room emptied. Ghost lay down next to Jon's body and wouldn't be moved. And then, alone in the room with a wolf and a corpse, Jon Snow took one terrible ragged breath and opened his eyes. And the first word he said was his wolf's name. The changes in him afterward were not dramatic and not immediate, which is the show at its most truthful about the experience of survival. He was physically depleted, disoriented in the way of someone who has come back from a very long distance and is not yet entirely sure where they are. Davos helped him through the first hours. Melisandre looked at him with the specific expression of a person who has just received evidence that their faith was not entirely misplaced after all, and was trying to figure out what to do with that relief. What changed was subtle and essential. He had been, before the stabbing, a man who did the right thing partly because he believed the right thing was worth dying for. He had now died for it, specifically and literally, and had come back. And the dying had clarified his relationship with mortality in ways that simply are not accessible to people who have not experienced it. He was not reckless. He was not indifferent to his life or to the lives of people who depended on him, but he had lost the specific flavor of fear that keeps people from doing necessary things when the necessary things are dangerous, the fear of the thing that waits on the other side. What waited on the other side was nothing. He could work with nothing. There is a moment in the early days of his second life where he stands on the ramparts of Castle Black alone, before anyone else has risen, and he looks north over the wall at the gray dawn light spreading across the landscape beyond, and there is nothing in his face that resembles relief. You might have expected relief, You might have expected the expression of a man grateful to find himself still here. Instead, he looks like someone considering the information of his own survival and trying to figure out what it obligates him to. The dying had not been the hard part. The coming back, with everything that coming back required, was harder. His first significant decision was to resign. His vows had said until my death. He had died. The contract was complete by its own terms. He was free. He took this position with the straightforward logic of someone for whom the technical reading of an agreement is also the correct one, and nobody could successfully argue him out of it, because the language was clear and he was very certain. The brothers who remained loyal to him, and there were enough, had captured the mutineers in the aftermath of the resurrection. Alliser Thorne and Bowen Marsh and the others were held until Jon was well enough to stand over them. He gave them the trial that was their right, under the Watch's own traditions, heard their cases, acknowledged that some of them had believed genuinely in what they were doing. He heard Thorne speak with the conviction of someone who had been wrong in a way that would never be corrected by experience, because the person most likely to provide the correction was standing there having survived being stabbed. He heard Ollie, who was still just a boy, who had lost his family to wildling raids, and whose entire framework for understanding the world had been built around that loss, and who had followed it to its logical conclusion without anyone intervening in time to redirect him. He hanged them all, not in fury, though the fury was real and had to be managed carefully. In the completion of his final duty as Lord Commander, the serving of justice for a wrong done within his command, he gave Alliser Thorne the opportunity to make his case, which Thorne made with the conviction of someone who had believed completely in what he was doing and was not asking for mercy, only acknowledgement. Jon gave the acknowledgement and hanged him anyway, because conviction is not a defense against the consequences of being catastrophically wrong about a thing that mattered. He hanged Ollie, and that was the hardest one to watch. The specific horror of Ollie is that his grief was real, and his loss was real, and the path from that real loss to that courtyard and that noose was made of steps that each followed logically from the one before, and there was nothing in the chain that was purely evil, just a boy's pain finding the nearest available expression for itself, and that expression being catastrophically wrong. Jon stood there and did the thing that needed to be done, and he carried what it cost him without showing it, because showing it would not have helped anyone, and the grief was his to manage privately, as most of his grief had always been managed. Then he took off the black cloak, gave Ed command of Castle Black, and walked out through the gate without looking back. He was nobody in particular with nowhere specific to be and no vows forcing his hand, for the first time in his adult life. He stood outside the gate in the cold and looked at the horizon, and Ghost was beside him, and the future was entirely open in a way that felt both liberating and deeply disorienting. Then Sansa arrived. The reunion at Castle Black is one of the moments where the show achieved something genuinely earned, the payoff of years of accumulated loss converted into the specific warmth of two people finding each other in the aftermath of impossible things. They had not been close in childhood. Sansa had been the court-minded eldest daughter, oriented toward the south and its manners, and Jon had been the bastard with the sword, and they had coexisted without much genuine connection. Now they embraced in the snow outside Castle Black and held on for a moment longer than was strictly necessary for a greeting, because they had both been a long time in the cold and were glad to have found another person with body heat. Sansa brought a purpose. Winterfell needed to be taken back. Ramsay Bolton was there and needed to be removed. Rickon was a captive and needed to be freed. Jon had spent months deciding he was done with war and politics and the machinery of power, and Sansa arrived and laid the case out with the patience of someone who understands that the argument needs to be made carefully. And he listened and agreed. And they started planning. Section 8. Bastard No More. The Battle of the Bastards and Stark Reunions. The road to the Battle of the Bastards was the road of inadequate resources and necessary improvisation that defines most genuinely dangerous undertakings. Jon and Sansa rode from castle to castle across the north, making their case to houses that had served the Starks for generations and were now in the process of making pragmatic decisions about which way the wind was blowing. Many refused. The Boltons held the keys to the kingdom right now, and refusing the Boltons had real and immediate consequences that the nobility of the north was not uniformly willing to risk for the sake of a resurrected bastard and his recently escaped sister, no matter how legitimate their claim. The refusals carry a particular weight when you think about what each one cost. Every lord who said no was a lord who had once bent the knee to Ned Stark, who had once ridden in Robb Stark's army, who had once spoken the words the North remembers without apparently meaning them in any way that survived the realities of Bolton occupation. Jon heard each refusal with the patience of someone who had long ago made peace with the gap between what people say they believe and what they are actually willing to do when belief requires sacrifice. He thanked them and moved on, because the doors that were closed, and the doors still open needed to be walked through before they closed too. What Jon assembled was a coalition of the willing and the small, the free folk, because Tormund Giantsbane's loyalty was absolute and personal, and the wildlings owed Jon a debt in the most literal possible sense of still being alive when they should not have been. Lyanna Mormont of Bear Island, perhaps the most impressive person to appear in the final 3 seasons of the series, who confronted Jon and Sansa in her hall with the contained ferocity of someone who had been running her house since she was a child, and was not in the habit of being impressed by anything less than genuine conviction. She asked hard questions, received the best answers Jon and Sansa could provide, and committed Bear Island's 62 soldiers with a dignity that made several larger houses feel embarrassed about their equivocation. Jon's meeting with Ramsay Bolton before the battle was the only face-to-face moment between the two people the battle was being fought over, and the contrast it presented was almost poetic in its clarity. Ramsay offered terms that were no terms at all, made threats delivered with the ease of a man who had spent a long time discovering exactly how much cruelty he was capable of, and had never found a ceiling. Jon offered Ramsay a different kind of resolution, one-on-one combat, the two of them, ending things cleanly. Ramsay declined, not because he was a coward exactly, but because he had never needed to take risks when he held the advantages he held. Jon rode back to his camp knowing the battle the next day was going to be expensive and possibly fatal, and sat with this knowledge in the way he had always sat with bad odds, not ignoring them, not pretending they were better than they were, but finding in the acknowledgement of difficulty the specific kind of clarity that comes when you stop trying to make the situation into something other than what it is. It was not enough. Both Jon and Sansa understood this. Ramsay had approximately 6,000 men, and the walls of Winterfell, and the tactical advantages that come with defending rather than attacking, and Jon had perhaps 2,000 at most, many of them free folk who were excellent fighters but not trained in formal battle formations. He told Melisandre not to bring him back if he fell. He said this simply, and she received it simply. Two people who had been through enough not to waste words on the conversation around the thing that needed to be said, the morning of the battle. Ramsay Bolton walked a chained and visibly broken Rickon Stark out into the open ground between the two armies and made his announcement. Rickon would run toward Jon. And Jon watched his little brother run, the youngest Stark, still a child, running across open ground in the specific way of someone who knows that hope is probably false, but is running toward it anyway because it is the only direction that makes sense when you are this close to safety. The arrows came one by one, and each one missed, and Jon's heart leaped each time. And then the arrow that did not miss came down, and Rickon fell, and Jon made a mistake. He was not thinking. He was past thought. He was grief converted into motion, forward momentum as the only available response to a loss that had happened too suddenly and too completely to be processed through the ordinary machinery of emotion. He rode forward alone, into the open ground between the armies, and Tormund behind him said the only word available, "Don't." Jon did not stop. The Bolton forces were waiting, and Ramsay's cavalry began their charge, and Jon drew Longclaw and somehow kept moving rather than being overrun. And then the Stark forces crashed into the cavalry from behind him, and the battle was underway, and it was immediately, obviously going wrong. The chaos of the battle is worth sitting with because it is doing something specific about the experience of being inside a fight where the numbers are against you. You cannot see the full picture. You can only see the area immediately around you, the people dying within arm's reach, the next threat, the next instant. The long view that strategy requires is completely unavailable. You are just surviving, and trying to keep the person next to you surviving, and the cost mounts in ways you cannot measure until after. Jon was knocked from his horse. He fought on foot. He was nearly crushed to death by the press of bodies as the Bolton forces encircled the Stark army and began the methodical compressing inward, the phalanx technique that reduces individual skill to irrelevance by simply removing the space required to use it. He went under and found something in himself that was not thought or strategy, but the simplest possible animal conviction, the one that says, not yet, and got back up. He was out of ideas and watching it end when the Knights of the Vale arrived on the ridgeline. Sansa had written to Littlefinger. She had told Jon she was doing it, and he had not wanted to use the help, because accepting resources from Petyr Baelish meant accepting a debt with a man who always collected on debts in ways that served him rather than you. She had done it anyway, because she was smarter about survival than Jon, and she understood that survival was the prerequisite for every other value, including the luxury of clean hands. The Vale cavalry hit the Bolton lines and broke them completely, and the battle turned in the space of a few minutes from disaster to victory. Jon chased Ramsay into Winterfell and beat him with his hands in the courtyard, the accumulated violence of everything Ramsay had done coming through his fists without any particular attempt at control, and stopped when he saw Sansa watching. Not because she asked him to, but because her presence brought him back into himself enough to remember that some forms of justice require the person who suffered most to be the one who administers them. He left Ramsay for her. She fed Ramsay to his dogs, and the Stark banner went up over Winterfell, and the world was briefly very still. The king and the North Declaration came in the Great Hall, with Lyanna Mormont's voice cutting through the initial silence, and the lords falling into line one by one, and the chant building. Jon stood there and absorbed this recognition of his leadership and his sacrifice and his right to be called what he was called, and his face in that moment carried everything at once: the gratitude, the exhaustion, the awareness of how many people were missing who should have been present, the complicated understanding that the acknowledgement he had always wanted as a child was arriving now, on the other side of so much loss. And it was real, and it was not enough to fill the spaces that the loss had left. He was home. He was surrounded by people who called him king. Ghost was beside him. And somewhere in the crypts below the castle, Rickon Stark was newly buried in the cold. Section 9. King in the North. The truth that destroyed everything. Being king in the North did not change Jon Snow's fundamental disposition toward power, which is to say that it did not make him hungry for more of it. He took the title and the responsibility with the same seriousness he had taken every other responsibility in his life, which meant he was immediately occupied with the actual work rather than the status attached to the work. The North needed organizing. Preparations against the coming winter needed to be accelerated. And the threat in the North, the real threat, the one that had not gone away just because there was now a political crisis in King's Landing layered on top of it, needed to be addressed with the urgency of something that was actually going to arrive whether or not it was convenient. He went south to Dragonstone because the dragonglass in the mountains there was not a diplomatic courtesy, but a strategic necessity, and because his warning about the Night King had received the political reception that warnings about existential threats from people without armies tend to receive. Polite skepticism combined with more pressing concerns. His first meeting with Daenerys Targaryen was two people of enormous conviction, discovering that conviction alone does not produce agreement. She expected him to kneel, as was the appropriate thing when a northern lord presented himself before a queen with dragons. He expected her to listen to what he knew about the threat from the north as if it were the most important information in the world, which it was. Neither of them was wrong in the way that two people can each be right and still be unable to immediately find the common ground their rights pointed toward. There is a moment early in their acquaintance where she describes her dragons to him and watches his face to see how he responds, whether he is frightened or dazzled or performing either. And what she finds instead is a man taking the information about dragons seriously in the specific way of someone for whom dragons are relevant data about a problem he is trying to solve rather than symbols of power to be impressed by. She files this away. It is the beginning of a shift in her assessment of him that will eventually become something more than assessment. What built between them over the weeks that followed was something that neither of them had particularly anticipated and that both of them found increasingly impossible to deny. They had each led armies and survived losses that would have broken most people. They spoke the same language of sacrifice and responsibility, even if the accents were different. They pushed each other in ways that made the pushing itself a form of respect. She tested his courage repeatedly, in the way that someone who has spent years determining who to trust tests the people in front of them, and he met each test with the specific quality of unperformed directness that was simply how he was made. He rode a dragon. It happened in the way that the most significant moments in Game of Thrones tend to happen, without announcement, almost as an aside. Drogon landed near Jon on the cliffs of Dragonstone, and Jon reached out his hand, and Drogon allowed it, which was information Daenerys filed away without processing it immediately because the implications were too large to look at directly in that moment. The expedition beyond the wall, the decision to capture a white and bring it south to show Cersei the reality of the threat, was one of the least defensible tactical decisions Jon ever made, and he made it with his eyes open. He needed proof that the Night King was real and coming, proof that would move people who were otherwise comfortable dismissing the problem as northern superstition. He could not make the argument with words alone, because he had been making it with words for years, and the words had not been enough. He needed evidence, and the only evidence that would move the Southern Lords was something they could see and touch and watch try to kill them. So he went north again. He and a small group, including Tormund, Jorah Mormont, Beric Dondarrion, Thoros of Myr, and the Hound, the strangest collection of people to be thrown together by a single mission since the Watch itself was founded, went beyond the wall to capture a living white for transport south. The mission went wrong. It almost always went wrong. They were surrounded. Thoros died. They sent for help. Daenerys came with her dragons. 3 dragons over the frozen landscape north of the wall, and then the Night King's spear, and then Viserion falling. She watched it happen and held herself together for the duration of the immediate crisis, and she did not allow herself to break until she was on the ship going south, and Jon was there, and the distance between them that had been maintained through weeks of careful restraint simply closed, because they had both just been through something that stripped away the arguments for distance. The romance, when it finally arrived on that ship. And Bran was simultaneously watching the vision of the Tower of Joy, the secret marriage, the secret birth. The show was intercutting the beginning of the love story with the information that would eventually break it, so that what should be a moment of warmth and possibility is wrapped in the knowledge we as viewers are accumulating of what they don't yet know about each other. It is one of the most structurally precise and most quietly cruel things the show ever did. Sam delivered the truth to Jon in the Winterfell crypts, surrounded by Stone Stark ancestors, during the opening moments of the final season. He told Jon about the marriage. He told Jon about the name. He told Jon that he was not Ned Stark's bastard. He was Aegon Targaryen, the legitimate son of Rhaegar Targaryen and Lyanna Stark, and he had the strongest claim to the Iron Throne of any living person. Jon's response was not that of a man whose ambitions have been validated. It was not even the response of a man who has received good news. It was the response of a man who has had the structural foundation of his sense of self pulled out from under him without warning, and who is now standing in a room looking at the shape of himself in the absence of the foundation that held it up. He had been the bastard. He had built himself out of that starting point, the limited and complicated and eventually liberating reality of being illegitimate in a world that arranged everything around legitimacy. Now he was being told it had been false from the beginning. He was legitimate. He was more legitimate than the woman he had been falling in love with. He was the thing he had never been allowed to be, which was what he already was. He could not tell Daenerys. He told her in the Godswood at Winterfell, with the quiet directness of someone for whom concealment is simply not a long-term available strategy, and she received the truth with eyes that were simultaneously calculating and frightened in a way that told him everything he needed to know about what the truth was doing to her sense of the world. She asked him to keep it secret. He told Sansa and Arya instead, because they were his family and because he was not capable of keeping a secret of this magnitude from the people he trusted most. Sansa's response was immediate and political, in the way that Sansa had always been political when it mattered. She understood exactly what this information meant and exactly what would happen when it spread, and she began thinking about what to do with it. The thinking led to telling Tyrion, Tyrion telling Varys, Varys beginning his letter-writing campaign. And the secret, once moving, became something neither Jon nor Daenerys could control. The fracture that opened between them was not dramatic. Dramatic might have been easier to navigate. It was quiet and incremental, expressed in the specific way that trust erodes when both parties know something is wrong and neither party has the right words for it. He was pulling back, not from lack of feeling, but from the impossibility of reconciling the feeling with the knowledge. She was watching him pull back and interpreting it through the lens of someone who had been betrayed by almost every ally she had ever relied on. And that interpretation was producing fear and anger in proportions that were changing her relationship to the decisions she was making. Section 10. The Long Night. Fighting for a world that won't remember him. The army of the dead arrived at Winterfell under a darkness that had the quality of intention, cold and complete, pressing against the walls of the castle with the patient certainty of something that has time. In the hours before it arrived, the castle prepared in the way that places prepare for things they cannot fully imagine, purposefully, thoroughly, and with the specific emotional texture of people who are doing everything right and are not certain it will be enough. Weapons were distributed, positions were assigned. Sam was given a dragonglass knife because nobody knew where else to put him, and Sansa was given a knife too and told to go to the crypts with the people who could not fight. And she went without arguing, which was one of the several signs that Sansa Stark had become someone who understood the difference between bravery and unnecessary exposure to danger. Jon and Daenerys spoke briefly, privately, in the last quiet minutes before the dead arrived. There was nothing left to say that had not already been said, or that could be said in the time available. They stood together in the cold and looked at the darkness gathering beyond the tree line, and they both knew, without saying it, that they were standing at the edge of the thing that Jon's entire life had been in some sense pointed toward. The wall, the watch, hard home, every decision and loss and sacrifice. It had all been prologue to this night. Whatever happened after, if there was an after, was a different story entirely. The plan fell apart almost immediately and was replaced by chaos managed as well as chaos can be managed, which is not particularly well. The Dothraki charged into the dark, and the fire of their araks went out. And then the horses came back without riders, and everyone watching from the walls understood without needing to be told what this meant. The Night King had arrived with numbers that made the earlier estimates look optimistic. Jon flew Rhaegal in the dark above the castle, trying to find the Night King, trying to intercept Viserion, trying to do something useful with the dragon, in conditions that made all of this extremely difficult. The aerial combat above Winterfell was extraordinary and horrible. Two dragons circling each other in the dark, one breathing orange fire, and one breathing something blue and cold that was wrong in the way fire from a dead thing is always wrong. Neither could kill the other. Jon could not reach the Night King. Things were happening below him that he could feel but not see. He landed in the courtyard and ran toward the Night King, and the Night King raised his hand, and the dead who had been killed during the battle began to rise. All of them, including people Jon had known. The specific horror of that moment, watching people you fought beside, friends and brothers and allies, stand up as enemies, is something the show had been building toward since the first encounter with the Whites at the Fist of the First Men. The dead are not strangers. The dead are your people, turned against you, wearing the faces of loss. Jon had known this intellectually since Hardhome. Knowing it intellectually is different from watching it happen in the courtyard of his own home. He kept moving. He was always kept moving. He could not kill the Night King directly, could not reach him through the wall of dead things standing between them, could not do the thing that every instinct and every piece of training said he was supposed to do in this moment. He was blocked. He was helpless. He stood in the middle of the greatest battle of his lifetime, and he could not reach the enemy that mattered. And then Arya arrived from nowhere, from the cold and the dark, in ways that were never fully explained beyond the implication that the training of the faceless men had made her capable of movement that was not quite ordinary movement anymore. She came from behind the Night King with the Valyrian steel dagger and drove it through his chest, and he shattered, and his army shattered with him. Jon Snow did not kill the Night King. He ran toward him and was not the one who finished it. He had done his work over years of decisions, the free folk south of the wall, the dragonglass found and manufactured into weapons, the alliance built despite every obstacle, and Arya had done the single act that ended it. This is completely fine with Jon, who is not the kind of person who needs credit for his contributions to be recognized in order to value those contributions. The Night King was dead. The people he loved were alive. That was enough. There is a question the ending of The Long Night asks, and it is worth sitting with. What is a hero? The traditional version of the hero story has the hero deliver the killing blow. Jon Snow, the person this entire narrative has been building as the hero of the Long Night story, the prince who was promised, the figure of prophecy, the one who died and came back, was not the person who killed the Night King. Arya was. And what does that say about the shape of heroism as Game of Thrones understood it? It says, I think, that the work of heroism is mostly invisible. It happens in the decisions that make other decisions possible. It happens in the years of unglamorous, unpopular, frequently punished effort to build the conditions in which the necessary thing can finally be done. Jon Snow did not kill the Night King, but without everything Jon Snow did, and chose, and suffered, and refused to stop doing even when the suffering became specific and personal and enormous, the Night King would never have been in the position where someone could kill him at all. The Free Folk were south of the Wall because of Jon. The dragonglass weapons were made because of Jon. Arya Stark was alive at Winterfell that night because Jon had taken it back. The conditions were Jon's work. The final blow was Arya's glory. And neither of them would have been there. None of it would have been possible without the other. What came next was the accumulation of damage that would eventually break Daenerys beyond what could be repaired in time. Jorah was dead, killed defending her in the chaos of the battle. The loss of Jorah was specifically the loss of the person who had loved her the longest, most consistently, most unconditionally, and his absence removed a floor that had been supporting her without her fully recognizing it was there. Rhaegal was killed in the Narrow Sea by Euron Greyjoy's fleet, shot down in a matter of seconds before anyone could respond, and the loss landed on her with the weight of a child's death, because that was what it was. Missandei was captured and executed on the walls of King's Landing, with a cruelty that was specifically calibrated to reach Daenerys in the place where she could not recover from it, and it worked. Jon watched this happening and could not find a way to be the thing he wanted to be for her, which was the human anchor that pulled her back from the edge she was approaching. The revelation of his heritage had created a distance between them that his love could not fully close. She was becoming more frightened, more isolated, more certain that she was surrounded by people who had chosen Jon over her, and that certainty was not entirely wrong, which made it more, rather than less, dangerous. Section 11, The Bells and the Breaking. Watching Daenerys burn everything. The march on King's Landing should have ended with the city's surrender and a transition of power conducted with reasonable efficiency and minimum casualties. Daenerys had Drogon, who was a weapon beyond anything Cersei could deploy or counter. She had an army that had just survived the Long Night, which meant something very specific in terms of hardness and motivation. She had the legitimate support of multiple major houses and the acknowledgement of the Northern Lords who had bent the knee after Jon had. She also had nothing left. Every person who had been a floor under her when the isolation pressed in was gone or compromised. Jorah was dead. Missandei was dead. Rhaegal was dead. Varys was dead, burned for his treason, which was a legally correct response, and also a visible indicator of someone who had stopped making distinctions between necessary severity and something less calibrated than severity. Tyrion was in her service but not fully trusted. Jon was in her service but pulling back in ways she felt more than she understood. Varys' death is worth pausing on, because Jon's response to it tells you something. Varys was killed because he had begun sending ravens to lords throughout Westeros, informing them of Jon's true heritage and suggesting that Jon would make the better ruler. It was an act of treason by any reasonable definition. Daenerys had him burned. Jon watched this happen and said nothing in public, but you could see in his face the specific calculation being made. This is the second person burned who was not an enemy soldier in the field. This is becoming a pattern. The woman he loved was beginning to use her dragon the way Targaryens of the past had used their dragons, as instruments of personal power rather than tools of liberation. And the distinction between those two things was quietly and terribly important. She arrived at King's Landing alone in the meaningful sense. The bells of surrender rang when the city fell, exactly as Tyrion had arranged, exactly as anyone watching had hoped. The fighting was over. All she had to do was accept the victory. She burned the city. She turned Drogon on the streets of a city that had already surrendered, and she swept back and forth in the methodical way of someone executing a plan rather than losing control. and the buildings came down and the fires spread, and the people who were in the buildings when the fires spread were inside the buildings when the buildings came down. The bells are the detail that haunts everything that follows. Not the burning itself, not the deaths, but the specific fact that the city had surrendered before the burning started. Surrendered armies are protected under the laws of war. Surrendered cities are protected. The bell ringing was not just a symbol, it was the moment at which the killing was supposed to stop. And Daenerys heard it, paused, and chose. Jon was in the streets. He watched it happen in real time and found nothing in his toolkit that was adequate to the situation. He tried to stop individual atrocities where he was physically present to stop them and could not be present everywhere simultaneously, which is the condition of trying to stand against institutional momentum with personal intervention. He watched soldiers he was commanding commit violence that he could not authorize and could not prevent, and the look on his face through those scenes is the specific look of a man watching the story he told himself about what he was doing here crack along lines he had been ignoring. He had told himself he was serving the larger good. He had told himself that the discomforts of this alliance, the burned Tarleys, the escalating severity, the moments where Daenerys had made a decision he could not quite justify to himself, were the costs of a larger purpose, the same way he had always found ways to carry costs in service of things bigger than himself. But, standing in the burning streets of King's Landing, with civilians dying in the buildings around him, and soldiers he had marched north, with committing atrocities he could not stop, the larger purpose was becoming very difficult to locate. Arya found him. She was in the city looking for Cersei, the name on her list, the completion of a mission she had been carrying since childhood, and instead she found the burning, and she found Jon, and she looked at him with the specific look of someone who has seen terrible things before, and has not stopped being horrified by them. She got out. He helped her. That single act of helping, one person extracted from one burning street, was the sum total of what Jon Snow could do about King's Landing. In the ruins of the Red Keep, with the ash falling like black snow and the city burning below the windows, Daenerys told Jon that she was going to liberate the entire world. Every city, every nation, every people who lived under rulers who oppressed them was going to receive the same gift she had just given King's Landing. She believed this completely. The architecture of her conviction was total, internally consistent, and entirely terrifying, the specific terror of ideology that has simplified its relationship with reality to the point where the complexity that gives rise to exceptions and mitigations and the acknowledgement of human suffering as an individual rather than aggregate phenomenon has been stripped away. Tyrion was in a cell. Jon visited him. Tyrion laid out the logic that Jon had already felt, but had been trying to avoid feeling, with the clarity of a man who has run out of things to protect. She is not going to stop. The next city will be the same. Your sisters will not kneel to her. She will see that as treason, and she will act on it. Jon sat with this for a long time. Longer, probably, than Tyrion thought he would sit with it. And Tyrion knew Jon well enough by now to understand that the sitting was not passivity. It was the way Jon processed the gap between what he felt and what he knew. And that gap, in this case, was the gap between loving someone and recognizing that loving someone was not a sufficient reason to permit the things they were going to do. He had spent his whole life learning that the things you love can require you to act against your comfort. The learning did not make this instance any easier. He sat with it, and at the end of the sitting, he had not moved from who he was. He was still the same person who had bent the knee in service of something larger than himself, and who could not, would not, allow that service to extend to excusing the burning of cities full of people who had already surrendered. He went to her in the throne room. He held her. He said her name with all the love and grief in him, and looked for the person he knew, looked for the woman on the cliff at Dragonstone who had been moved by his certainty, the woman on the boat going south who had let down the armor for one night, the woman on Dragonback who had lost a child to a spear and held herself together anyway. He couldn't find her. That is the truest way to say it. The person he was holding was Daenerys Targaryen, and she was also someone who had passed through something that had changed the boundaries of what she was capable of. And the person he had loved was somewhere inside that, but no longer accessible in any way that he could reach. The gap between them was not one conversation wide. It was everything that had happened since the bells. And he killed her. He said she was his queen, now and always, and he meant it. And he put the knife in, and she fell, and he held her. and Drogon arrived and burned the Iron Throne until it was nothing. Section 12. The True Ending. Exile, Justice, and What It All Means. Jon spent weeks in a cell while the world negotiated what to do with him. Grey Worm wanted justice in the form of death, which was not an unreasonable position for a man whose queen had been assassinated by the man she had trusted most. The assembled lords of Westeros wanted a solution that did not require them to fight another war, in the immediate aftermath of finishing the one they had just come through. Sansa made it clear that the North considered Jon a Stark, and therefore a matter of northern sovereignty rather than southern justice. Tyrion from prison made the argument he had available to make, which was that Jon had prevented greater carnage at personal cost, and that the appropriate response to this was not execution but arrangement. The arrangement that emerged from the Dragon Pit Council was exile. Jon would be returned to the Night's Watch, which was technically a lifelong sentence and technically already the arrangement he had been under twice before. And he would serve at the Wall and live out his days there and make no further claims on anything. The Unsullied, given this resolution and with their queen's body carried away by Drogon into the unknown, took their ships and sailed for Noth, as Missandei had always dreamed of. The North was independent. Sansa had extracted this as her price and received it with the calm of someone who always knew this was the outcome the North deserved and had simply been waiting for the circumstances in which extracting it was possible. She was crowned queen in the North and wore the crown with a dignity that had been earned rather than inherited, which gave it a different quality than the crowns of most of the people who had worn crowns in the world of Game of Thrones. Arya sailed west into waters that no map had successfully charted, which was so precisely Arya that it required no explanation from any of the people who knew her. Jon was delivered to Castle Black by a small escort, and Ghost was there. The reunion with Ghost addressed something the show had left open in a way that had hurt viewers, the departure in the previous season when Jon had sent Ghost north with Tormund without so much as a backward glance, which had landed as callousness and had accumulated in the fandom's memory as a wound that needed acknowledgement. Here was the acknowledgement. Jon dropped to his knees in the snow and put his hands on Ghost's face and held on, and Ghost leaned into him without reservation or condition, and the reconciliation was quiet and complete and said everything that needed to be said. Tormund was there. The Free Folk were there, waiting, because they had nowhere particular to be, and Jon was the reason many of them were still alive to be nowhere. Jon looked at the wall behind him, and then at the open country ahead, and then at the people around him, and he walked through the gate, not to serve a sentence, not because the Night's Watch had asked him to stay, because the lands beyond the wall had always been the place where he was most fully himself, and the last surviving reason to live south of it had been walked out of the world by his own hand, and the season was changing, and the green was coming through the snow. The final image is genuinely one of the most beautiful pieces of filmmaking in the series, and that is not a small thing to say about a show that had many beautiful moments. Jon Snow, Ghost, Tormund Giantsbane, and the Free Folk walking through a forest that is coming back to life. The gate of Castle Black growing small behind them. The ground beneath their feet showing the first small evidences of a spring that is finally arriving after years of anticipated and actual winter. And Jon's face, not triumphant being absolutely the wrong word for any of this, but something that is quieter and more earned than triumph. Something like arriving. Think about what this ending is actually saying. Jon Snow was, by the rules of the world of Game of Thrones, the most legitimate person alive to sit on the Iron Throne. He had the blood, the lineage, the demonstrated capacity for leadership, the support of people who had followed him through death and beyond. He could have claimed it. He chose not to claim it, not once but repeatedly, at every point where claiming it became an option. He was not humble in the performative sense of humility. He was honest about what he wanted and did not want, and what he did not want was the throne. What the throne represented, what the world south of the wall represented, was the system that had spent his entire life defining him by what he lacked rather than what he had. Bastard, Lord Commander of a dying institution, king in the north of a kingdom whose acknowledgement had come at enormous cost, and whose politics had already begun pulling apart by the time he arrived at King's Landing. The system had used him in all of these roles and had delivered him, at the end of it, to a cell. The lands beyond the wall had never needed him to be anything other than himself. Ygritte had taught him this. The Free Folk had confirmed it. Every person north of the wall who had chosen to follow Jon had chosen the person, not the title, not the blood, not the institutional role. They had chosen him, the specific and peculiar and sometimes maddening human being who was Jon Snow. And that choosing had the quality of something you can build an actual life out of. He was not being punished by walking north. He was completing a journey that had been in progress since he first went beyond the wall as a young man of the Night's Watch and met a red-haired wildling who looked at him and immediately knew that he knew nothing. He had learned. Over years of loss and death and resurrection and love and grief and impossible choice, he had learned. He had learned what the things that mattered actually were and what they cost and why they were worth the cost. He had learned that the categories the world uses to sort people into important and unimportant are not the same as the truth about people. He had learned that doing the right thing has value independent of whether it produces reward. He had learned that love is worth feeling even when it ends in grief. He was the most tragic hero in Game of Thrones because all of this learning began at a price that should not be required of anyone, and because the world that benefited from his learning did not, in the end, have a place for him in it. He saved the North, and it declared him king. He saved the Seven Kingdoms from Daenerys, and it exiled him. He bent every rule and broke every convention in service of what was actually right. And the convention and the rule had the final administrative word. And he walked away from it all anyway. Not with bitterness, though the bitterness would have been understandable, but with the particular quality of a person who has finally found the place where they do not have to perform anything anymore. The place where the pretending ends and the being begins. There is something worth saying about who Jon Snow was in that final walk that we don't always give enough credit to. He had been told his entire life that belonging was conditional on legitimacy, on position, on the approval of people with the power to grant or withhold it. He had spent decades either earning belonging or being excluded from it. The Night's Watch gave him belonging, then murdered him. The North gave him belonging, then watched him walk into exile. Daenerys offered him a different kind of belonging, one that came with the price of becoming someone he was not. The Free Folk had never asked him to be anything different. That was always the meaning of the North of the Wall scenes, from the moment Ygritte started picking apart his assumptions about what he was. Free Folk culture does not run on titles or bloodlines. It runs on what you can do and who you actually are when things get difficult. By that measure, Jon Snow was exactly where he had always belonged. The bastard boy who grew up at the edges of Winterfell, the ranger who fell in love north of the Wall, the man who could not stop doing the right thing even when it cost him everything. None of those people needed a throne. All of them needed this: open country, the people who chose them freely, and Ghost's pale weight walking beside them in the snow. The snow was fresh, the trees were tall, Ghost was beside him. There is something in Jon Snow's story that the great traditions of storytelling have been trying to articulate for a very long time. The thing about what real heroism looks like from the inside, when the outside is not cooperating. It does not look like victory. It does not look like recognition. It looks like a man walking into the wilderness with a wolf and a friend and a people, with the world he saved behind him, getting on with the getting on, and the rest of his life ahead of him in the cold, clean air, unscheduled and unscripted and entirely his own at last. He had always been this. It just took everything else being stripped away for the being this to be all that was left. There is one more thing worth saying before this story closes. Game of Thrones spent 8 seasons asking a single question in 100 different ways. What does it actually mean to be good? Not what does it mean to be effective, or powerful, or admired, or politically successful. Those questions get answered all over the place, with varying and frequently grim results. But what does goodness look like, in the specific context of a world that punishes it consistently and rewards its opposites? Jon Snow is the show's fullest attempt at an answer. His goodness was not the goodness of innocence, because Jon was never innocent in the sense of being unacquainted with the world's capacity for cruelty. He had seen too much too early. His goodness was not the goodness of detachment, because he was attached to everything, to his family, to his brothers in the Watch, to Ygritte, to the Free Folk, to Sam, to Ghost, to the mission of protecting the living from the dead, to the truth even when the truth was the most inconvenient thing imaginable. He was attached to all of it and was hurt by all of it, because that is what attachment costs, and he was willing to pay the cost over and over. His goodness was the goodness of someone who decided, early and without fanfare, that doing the right thing was more important than being comfortable, more important than being liked, more important than surviving in the specific form his survival might have taken if he had been more willing to make the compromises the world kept offering him. He was offered compromises continuously. He refused them continuously, not with speeches or dramatic statements, but simply by being unable to do the thing the compromise required, because the thing it required was becoming someone he wasn't, and he was very clear about who he was. This is, when you think about it, remarkable. It is remarkable in a show where almost every character of significance eventually does become something they weren't, under the pressure of events, or ambition, or grief, or love. Cersei became a monster by increments. Daenerys, we are shown, became something she once opposed. Jaime's arc is the story of a man becoming better and then choosing, in the most painful possible moment, to return to who he was before. Even Sansa's journey is the story of a girl who had to become a different and harder person in order to survive. Jon did not become a different person. He was tested, repeatedly and at enormous cost, and he came out of every test as recognizably, stubbornly himself. He was damaged by the tests. He was tired and grieved and alone in ways that accumulated rather than resolving, but he did not change in the fundamental sense. The Jon Snow who walked north at the end was the same person who had stood at the edges of Winterfell's great hall as a boy, watching the legitimate world do its legitimate business, and felt the particular loneliness of someone who cannot make himself belong to a world that requires him to be other than what he is. He never stopped being that person. He just found, eventually, the world where that person belonged. And the world was north, and it was cold, and it was open, and Ghost was there, and they walked into it together. If you are watching this and wondering whether Jon's ending was justice or punishment, whether walking away from everything was freedom or loss, the answer is that it was both, and that holding both truths at once is how you understand Jon Snow correctly. He was always both things simultaneously: the bastard who was a prince, the man who died and lived, the king who refused to rule, the hero who lost and won at the same time, quietly, in the snow, going north. The North remembers, and so do we. We read every single one. And if you've made it this far through the entire arc of Jon Snow's life, thank you. Stories this full of grief and courage deserve to be told carefully and received the same way, and you brought both tonight. One last thing, and it matters more than it might seem. Wherever you are in the world right now, watching this, what time is it? What does the room look like? Is there a window, and is there snow outside it? Drop that in the comments, just that, because stories like Jon Snow's are better when they are shared, and the specific moment you chose to spend with this one is worth remembering. Like the video if it meant something to you. Subscribe so we can keep doing this together. There are so many more characters in this world whose stories deserve exactly this kind of attention, and we will get to every one of them. Until then, may your fires burn warm and your wolves stay close. And remember what Jon Snow spent his whole life trying to teach the people around him. The thing coming for all of us doesn't care about our titles or our grudges or the distinctions we draw between ourselves. It only cares whether we face it together or apart. He was right about that. He was always right about that. The tragedy is how long it took everyone else to believe him, and what that delay cost.